August 15, 1945. Tokyo stands in ruins. The city once called the heart of an empire is now a wasteland of ashes and silence. Buildings reduced to skeletons, streets lined with broken bicycles. The smell of soot and summer humidity blending into a heavy, unbearable stillness. In homes with shattered windows, families gather around wooden radios, black boxes humming with static. The air crackles. Somewhere, a woman hushes her crying child. Others kneel, eyes fixed on the device, waiting. At exactly noon, the static clears. A trembling voice, distant and formal, echoes through the chaos. It is not the voice of a general, nor the bark of an order. It is calm, soft, almost sorrowful. This war has not necessarily developed to Japan's advantage. The people freeze. Many have never heard this voice before, the sacred voice of Emperor Hirohito himself, the voice that was once divine, now descending through the airwaves like a ghost. And as the broadcast continues, Japan learns that its centuries of empire have come to an end. By the summer of 1945, Japan was a nation suffocating under the weight of its own war. Once, its armies had thundered across Asia through China, Indochina, and the Pacific. Its navy had ruled distant seas. But now, the empire was bleeding from every front. The skies above Tokyo were no longer its own. American B-29 bombers crossed them at will, leaving behind curtains of fire. From March to August 1945, the air raids consumed over 60 cities. Tokyo burned first, then Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe. Entire neighborhoods turned to blackened grids. More than 500,000 civilians were killed. Every night, families fled to rivers and fields to escape the inferno. Every dawn, they returned to the ruins of their homes. There was no safety, no food, no fuel. Even children collected scrap metal and empty shell casings to feed a war that no longer had meaning. The imperial propaganda still promised victory, the decisive battle that would turn the tide. Posters showed heroic pilots diving into enemy ships. Newspapers spoke of divine winds that would save the homeland. But deep down, most knew the truth. Japan was cornered. Its navy was gone, shattered in the Philippine Sea and Leyte Gulf. Its merchant fleet, once the artery of the empire, lay beneath the waves. Without oil, without steel, the factories had fallen silent. Trains barely ran. Starvation crept into the cities while the countryside could no longer feed itself. The people endured, bound by the idea of Gaimon to bear the unbearable. Even in ruin, they bowed to portraits of the emperor. His image remained untouchable, his divinity unspoken. Inside the imperial palace, however, unity was fracturing. The military leaders, men like War Minister Anami Korechika and General Umezu Yoshijiro, refused to surrender. They believed Japan must fight to the last man, to defend the sacred homeland at any cost. Others, led by Foreign Minister Shigenori Tg and Admiral Suzuki, saw only death ahead. They pleaded for peace, seeking Soviet mediation before it was too late. In council meetings, voices rose and tempers broke. To surrender meant the destruction of the emperor's godlike status, perhaps even his death. Yet to continue fighting meant national suicide. By July, the United States and its allies issued the Potsdam Declaration. It demanded Japan's unconditional surrender, or prompt and utter destruction. The phrase was dismissed by Tokyo's leaders as empty threat until the destruction came in a form no one could have imagined. But, even before the mushroom clouds, death already ruled the streets. The firebombing of Tokyo in March 1945 had killed more civilians in a single night than either Hiroshima or Nagasaki would weeks later. Survivors described the Sumida River boiling with bodies. Children lost their voices screaming for parents who never returned. And still, the government told them to prepare bamboo spears for the decisive battle for the homeland. In schools, girls practiced carrying grenades. Civilians dug trenches and tunnels that would never be used. The Imperial General Headquarters planned to mobilize 2 million troops, many without guns, to repel the expected American invasion of Kyushu. Every family expected to die. Every prayer was whispered for a war that could not be won. Then these final months, Japan was no longer a nation at war. It was a nation awaiting death. The leaders clung to delusion, the soldiers to duty, the people to silence. Yet somewhere beneath the rubble, an unspoken truth was spreading. The divine empire was crumbling, and in that crumbling world, a single decision to surrender or to die would determine the fate of millions. Soon, the skies above Hiroshima would decide for them. On the morning of August 6, 1945, a clear blue sky hung over the city of Hiroshima. At 8:15 a.m., the calm was split by a single aircraft, the Enola Gay. Seconds later, the world changed forever. A blinding flash, a rising column of fire, a city erased. 80,000 lives extinguished in an instant. Tens of thousands more would die in the days that followed from burns, from radiation, from a silence no one could explain. Tokyo received only fragments of the news. Communications collapsed. Officials spoke in confusion. The word Genshibakuden, atomic bomb, was whispered in disbelief. Most had never heard such a thing was possible. The army insisted Hiroshima was destroyed by ordinary bombing. It could not admit defeat to a weapon beyond comprehension. 3 days later, on August 9th, as the government hesitated, a second sun rose over Nagasaki. At that same hour, thousands of miles to the north, the Soviet Union, until then a neutral party, unleashed its armies into Manchuria. 1.5 million troops of the Red Army crashed through Japanese defenses that had once seemed impenetrable. The Kwantung Army, Japan's largest and most prestigious force, was annihilated within days. The illusion of defense was gone. For the first time in the war, Japan faced invasion from both east and west, the Americans from the Pacific, the Soviets from Asia. There was nowhere left to stand. Inside the imperial palace, chaos reigned. The government met in near-constant sessions, known as the Supreme Council for the Direction of the War. Torn between annihilation and surrender, 6 men held the fate of the nation in their hands. Prime Minister Kantaro Suzuki and Foreign Minister Teiji urged acceptance of the Potsdam terms, but the military chiefs, Anami Yumizu and Toyota, refused to yield. They feared the loss of Japan's kokutai, the national essence, the divine lineage of the emperor. To surrender, they believed, would destroy the spirit of Japan itself. Only one man could break the deadlock: Emperor Hirohito. For centuries, the emperor had remained a distant, divine figure, his voice never heard by ordinary subjects, his opinions never spoken in council. But now, faced with the total destruction of his nation, he intervened in the early hours of August 10th. After a long night of debate, Hirohito entered the underground war room. The air was thick with exhaustion, the sound of air raid sirens in the distance. He spoke quietly, deliberately. He told his ministers that to continue the war would bring nothing but ruin to his people. The time had come, he said, to endure the unendurable. His words carried the weight of centuries of divine silence broken. For the first time in Japanese history, the emperor had overruled his own generals. The decision was made: Japan would surrender. But even then, not all obeyed. Within the army, whispers of revolt spread like fire. Young officers swore oaths to die rather than see their country humiliated. They saw surrender as betrayal, a dagger to the soul of the nation. On the night of August 14th, as the emperor prepared to announce the surrender by radio broadcast, a group of officers attempted a desperate coup. Their plan: to storm the imperial palace, seize the recording of the emperor's speech, and destroy it before it could be transmitted. They called it the Kiru incident. Inside the dark corridors of the palace, loyal guards clashed with conspirators. The emperor's record, 2 lacquer discs hidden in a minister's office, became the most precious objects in Japan. If they were found and destroyed, the war would continue. If they survived, Japan would finally fall silent. That night, as gunfire echoed faintly in the distance, the fate of a nation balanced on 2 fragile records and the voice of a man no one had ever heard. By dawn, the coup had failed. The discs were safe. The radio stations prepared. At noon on August 15, 1945, Japan would hear the voice from the sky, the human angle, the nation in ashes. When dawn broke over Japan on August 15th, the war was already lost, but few dared to say it aloud. In towns where the sirens had become the rhythm of life, civilians awoke to a strange quiet. For the first time in years, no bombers came. No explosions followed. The sky was clear, but the air was heavy, as if the nation itself were holding its breath. Across the ruins, life continued in small, tragic routines. Mothers queued for rice that never arrived. Children scavenged through rubble for bits of metal or food scraps. Farmers tilled blackened soil that could no longer bear crops. Hunger was not a condition. It was a way of life. Entire families lived in holes dug into the earth. The smell of mold, smoke, and sweat clung to their clothes. In the cities, silence was punctuated by distant sobs and the faint hum of radios being tuned for civilians. Surrender was not relief, it was confusion. The government had taught them that surrender meant dishonor, captivity, and perhaps extermination. American soldiers were described as monsters. Many civilians believed that once Japan surrendered, they would be slaughtered that morning. People gathered in their homes, temples, and schools, unsure whether to hope or to fear. They had lived through years of propaganda, of blind obedience. Now, they were about to hear the voice of their God. No one knew what that would mean: the technological angle, the voice that ended a war. The dual voice broadcast Gyakian Hosk was one of the most significant technological moments in world history. It was the first time a Japanese emperor's voice was ever heard by his people, and it was made possible by a fragile chain of 1940s recording equipment, human courage, and timing measured in minutes. Inside NHK's radio station in Tokyo, engineers worked through the night of August 14th under strict secrecy. They received 2 lacquer records, recorded hours earlier at the Imperial Palace. The voice on them was faint, poetic, and filled with archaic words few could understand. To the engineers, it sounded more like a prayer than a command. The transmission was planned with military precision. At exactly noon on August 15th, the Imperial Household Ministry ordered the broadcast to be transmitted through the National Radio Network, a web of transmitters stretching across Japan and its colonies. From Tokyo to Seoul, from Formosa to Manchuria, a single sound would ripple through the empire. But the technology was fragile. A single mistake could erase everything. Japan's power grid was in ruins. Air raids had destroyed many transmission lines. The engineers feared an outage could silence the emperor's words forever. To prevent this, backup systems were armed, and operators guarded the discs as though they were sacred relics. When the moment came, the discs were placed on a turntable. The stylus dropped, and through static, the trembling voice of Emperor Hirohito emerged. The sound was thin, ghostly, echoing through homes, schools, and military camps. For many, it was the first human sound they had ever associated with the emperor. The divine had become audible. The radio, once a weapon of propaganda, had become a vessel of surrender. The leadership angle, the emperor's silence broken in Japan's mythology. The emperor was not merely a man. He was a living descendant of the sun goddess Emmet. His word was divine, his presence sacred. Ordinary people never saw him, never heard him. His voice was the essence of authority and purity beyond human comprehension. Hirohito's decision to speak, therefore, was not just political, it was cosmic. For years he had been shielded from the horrors of the war that bore his name. He signed declarations, read briefings, and heard victories described in careful language. But by 1945, even the walls of the palace could not hide the truth. He could see the smoke from Tokyo's destruction from his own windows. He knew what had become of his empire when he addressed his ministers before the surrender. He did not speak as a general or ruler, he spoke as a father of a dying nation. His words were restrained, wrapped in traditional phrases. We have resolved to pave the way for a grand peace for all generations to come. In private, witnesses described him as pale, almost trembling. He understood that surrender would destroy the divine image built around him for centuries. But he also understood something more profound, that silence would destroy his people. By choosing to speak, Hirohito ended not just a war but a way of life. The myth of divine infallibility shattered the moment his voice echoed through the static. He became mortal, a man heard in grief. That act of speech was both surrender and salvation. And beyond the palace walls, millions listened, unsure whether to rejoice, mourn, or fall to their knees. As the last words of the broadcast faded, the silence returned. Some bowed deeply toward their radios. Others wept quietly. A few soldiers drew their swords, whispering apologies to ancestors they believed they had failed. The voice from the sky had spoken, but the meaning and its consequences were only beginning to unfold. The military angle, the soldiers who refused to hear for Japan's armed forces. Surrender was not simply defeat, it was annihilation of the spirit. When the emperor's voice echoed through the radios at noon, many soldiers did not understand it. The archaic language, formal, poetic, and wrapped in imperial restraint, never once used the word surrender. Instead, Hirohito spoke of enduring the unendurable and accepting the conditions of the declaration. In barracks across Asia, confusion turned to denial. In China, Burma, and the islands of the Pacific, units were cut off from communication. Some officers destroyed their radios rather than listen. Others insisted the message was a forgery by the Allies. To them, the war was not over, because the emperor could never surrender. At airfields, kamikaze pilots who had trained to die for the homeland were ordered to stand down. Some refused. They climbed into their planes and flew their final missions, not toward American ships, but toward the empty sea, vanishing into the horizon. On sea, in the jungles of Luzon, in the caves of Okinawa, scattered soldiers continued to fight for weeks, months, even years. They believed the voice they heard was not real, that the emperor had been captured, or that his message had been twisted by enemy propaganda. For these men, surrender was impossible because their training, their loyalty, and their entire identity were built upon death before dishonor. The code of Bushido, the way of the warrior, left no room for survival in defeat. The military spirit had been molded by centuries of imperial devotion. Now, in a single broadcast, that faith had been broken. Some soldiers knelt and wept, others drew their blades and took their own lives. It was a paradox of loyalty even in disobeying. They believed they were serving the emperor at the enemy angle, the allies who waited for the word across the Pacific. Allied forces stood ready for the most catastrophic invasion in human history, Operation Downfall. The American High Command had estimated over 1 million Allied casualties if Japan chose to fight on. Civilians, too, would perish in the millions. For that reason, every Allied soldier, every aircrew, every sailor listened closely in those days of August, waiting for confirmation that the war was truly ending. When the surrender was announced, many refused to believe it at first. In Guam, American intelligence officers replayed the broadcast repeatedly, trying to confirm that it was genuine. The emperor's voice, filtered through Japanese syntax and static, was nearly incomprehensible to non-native listeners. But the message spread quickly. The war is over. Read the headlines across the Allied world. In the streets of London, Paris, and New York, crowds erupted in celebration. Soldiers hugged strangers, church bells rang, and confetti filled the skies. In Washington, President Truman announced, "This is the day we have been waiting for since Pearl Harbor." But among the military planners, relief mixed with something colder realization. They had just witnessed a new age of warfare, an age defined by atomic power. Japan's surrender was not simply a victory, it was a warning. The American occupation forces, led by General Douglas MacArthur, began preparations to enter Japan, yet they approached with caution. The memory of fanatic resistance on Iwo Jima and Okinawa still burned in their minds. They expected ambushes, sabotage, or mass suicide. Instead, when the first Allied troops landed on Japanese soil, they found quiet streets, bowed heads, and soldiers neatly stacking their weapons. The empire that had once fought to the death was now motionless, listening still to the voice that had told them to stop. The moral and philosophical angle, the weight of surrender for Japan. Surrender was not merely a political act. It was a collapse of a moral universe for generations. The Japanese people had been taught that the emperor was divine, a living god. The empire's wars were fought in his name. Dying for him was the highest honor. To yield, therefore, was to betray everything sacred. But when the voice from the sky declared an end to war, something profound shifted. The divine became human. The invincible became fallible. Hirohito's broadcast was not only an acceptance of defeat, it was an unmaking of myth. His words, soft, formal, and filled with sorrow, spoke of compassion and endurance, not conquest or vengeance. In that moment, Japan's spiritual foundation cracked open for some. It was liberation, an end to the tyranny of fanaticism, and the beginning of peace. For others, it was unbearable shame. In the days that followed, countless soldiers and civilians took their own lives, unable to reconcile their devotion with the reality of surrender. Philosophically, it was the death of the Meiji dream, the idea of Japan as a divine empire destined to lead Asia. The war had ended not with heroic sacrifice, but with a quiet voice asking its people to survive in the years to come. Many would interpret Hirohito's decision as an act of mercy. Others would call it a betrayal of the warrior's code, but all agreed on one thing. It marked the rebirth of Japan. A nation built on obedience was now forced to learn humility. A culture that worshipped silence now began to speak again, and beneath the ruins, something fragile yet enduring stirred the will to live. From that moral stillness came a new question. What would become of Japan now that the war, and its emperor's divinity, had both ended? The answer would begin in the tense hours of the coup that almost prevented the voice from ever being heard. Tokyo, August 14, 1945. The air hung heavy with heat and fear. Thunder rumbled in the distance, but the real storm was gathering inside the imperial palace. In the corridors of polished wood and paper walls, armed men moved in silence. Their boots clicked softly, their rifles gleamed faintly under the dim electric light. They were not invaders. They were Japanese soldiers, men of the 2nd Regiment of the Imperial Guard, and they had come to save Japan by force. At their head was Major Kenji Hatanaka, a 33-year-old officer whose devotion to the emperor had turned into a desperate obsession. To Hatanaka and his co-conspirators, surrender was treason, a betrayal of the millions who had already died. The emperor's decision, they believed, had been coerced by weak ministers. They would not allow Japan to bow to the enemy. Their plan was audacious and simple: seize the imperial palace, prevent the broadcast of the emperor's surrender speech, and force a continuation of the war. That night, the palace became a battlefield of shadows. At around 1 a.m., the rebels surrounded the palace gates. They cut phone lines, disarmed guards, and declared martial law under the authority of the Eastern Army. Had believed other units across Tokyo would join, that the army's honor would rise to defend the emperor's true will. But few did. Most commanders hesitated, unwilling to turn their guns against their own emperor. Still, the coup pressed on. Hatanaka and his men stormed the offices of the Imperial Household Ministry, searching for the lacquered discs that contained the emperor's recorded surrender message. The discs, fragile, only 12 inches wide, were hidden inside a padded bag by court officials. They represented not just a recording, but the soul of a nation's future. Somewhere in the labyrinthine palace halls, loyal guards and ministers were hiding them. The conspirators tore through the building, overturning drawers, smashing doors, shouting threats. The echo of their boots merged with the hum of cicadas outside. The palace, a sacred forbidden space, had become a scene of chaos. In the darkness, one man, Chamberlain Yoshihiro Tokugawa, clutched the discs in terror. He and his fellow courtiers moved silently through hidden corridors, carrying the recordings to a safe place. Their mission: to keep the emperor's voice alive until morning. Meanwhile, Hatanaka tried to convince senior officers to support him. He approached Lieutenant General Takeshi Mori, commander of the Imperial Guard Division, the one man whose cooperation could legitimize the coup. But Mori refused. He told Hatanaka that the emperor's decision was final. Moments later, Hatanaka drew his pistol and shot Mori dead. The sound of the gunshot echoed through the palace grounds, a crack in the silence of centuries. Hatanaka then forged a document in Mori's name to justify the coup, ordering troops to secure the palace and arrest the ministers responsible for surrender. For a brief, terrible moment, it seemed the coup might succeed. But outside, confusion reigned. Many soldiers did not know what was happening. Others sensed something sacred was being violated. The Eastern Army's commander, General Shizuki Tanaka, was informed of the uprising. Furious, he immediately ordered Hatanaka to stand down by dawn. The rebels' courage began to fracture. Their radios brought no news of support. Their supposed allies remained silent. As the sun rose over Tokyo, the conspirators realized they were alone. The emperor, protected within the palace, remained calm. His aides reported that he slept briefly that night, unaware of how close his words had come to being silenced forever. Outside, Hatanaka, pale and trembling, wandered through the city as the coup collapsed around him. At 7 a.m., he went to NHK's broadcast station, pistol in hand, demanding airtime to explain his actions. He was refused. At 8 a.m., General Tanaka confronted him directly. "You have disgraced the emperor," he said coldly. Hatanaka bowed deeply, tears streaming down his face, and fled. Hours later, as noon approached, the hour of the emperor's broadcast, Hatanaka rode his motorcycle through the streets of Tokyo, scattering leaflets, pleading for understanding. "I did it for the emperor," they read. "I did it for my country." Moments before noon, he stopped his motorcycle, drew his pistol, and shot himself. His final act was to press his bloodied cap to his forehead in salute. The coup was over. The discs were safe, and as the city sweltered under the August sun, the world held its breath in minutes. The voice that Hatanaka tried to silence would speak not of glory or conquest, but of surrender. Noon approached. The city of Tokyo was still. No sirens, no gunfire, only heat shimmering above the blackened ruins. Civilians gathered inside shattered homes and crowded temples, listening to radios perched on wooden tables or balanced atop bricks. Across the empire in Seoul, Taipei, and the jungles of Burma, millions did the same. Soldiers paused their drills. Prisoners in camps strained to hear. Somewhere in the Pacific, a submarine crew tuned in through static for a nation that had lived in obedience to silence. This moment was beyond imagination. The emperor, the descendant of the sun goddess, would speak. At exactly 12 p.m. August 15, 1945, a voice emerged from the static. Soft, measured, trembling. After pondering deeply the general trends of the world and the actual conditions obtaining in our empire today, it was not the voice of command, but of grief. The language was formal, archaic, the bungo style of imperial Japanese. Many could not understand its meaning in real time, but they understood its tone. There was sorrow in it, and finality. Hirohito spoke slowly, his words recorded the night before on fragile lacquer discs. He told his people that the war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage. He spoke of the enemy's new and most cruel bomb availed, reference to the atomic destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and then came the line that ended an empire. "We have decided to effect a settlement of the present situation by resorting to an extraordinary measure." No one dared breathe on homes and offices. Soldiers and civilians leaned closer to the radio, straining to hear. Hirohito continued, explaining that to continue the war would lead to the total extinction of human civilization. His voice, delicate but firm, carried both sorrow and resolve. "To save the people," he said, "we have resolved to endure the unendurable and to suffer what is insufferable." Those words, "endure the unendurable," became etched into Japan's collective memory. They were not the language of victory or defeat, but of survival. When the broadcast ended, the static returned. Then nothing. The silence was heavier than any sound that had preceded it. Across Japan, reactions unfolded in waves of disbelief and grief. Some wept quietly, others screamed. A few, unable to face the shame, took their own lives. In government offices, officers drew their swords and fell upon them. In rural towns, farmers fell to their knees and pressed their foreheads into the dirt. In some homes, mothers bowed before the radio, whispering apologies to sons who would never return. In the ruins of Tokyo, a woman clutched her child and whispered, "It's over." For those who had lost everything, homes, families, the promise of empire, the emperor's voice was both a wound and a bomb. The soldiers of the imperial army listened in stunned silence. Many refused to believe what they had heard. Some destroyed their weapons immediately. Others buried them beneath the soil. In Manchuria and the Pacific Islands, units ignored the broadcast entirely, convinced it was an enemy trick. But for the vast majority, the truth soon settled like dust after a storm. Their war was over. At that same moment, far from Tokyo, in the offices of Allied command, translators confirmed the message. The Japanese emperor had surrendered. President Truman, when informed, reportedly murmured, "This is the day we've been waiting for." But for Japan, it was not a day of celebration. It was a day of mourning. The empire that had once stretched across Asia was finished. Its soldiers were prisoners of fate, its people captives of exhaustion. Yet beneath the sorrow, something deeper stirred, a fragile realization that survival itself was now an act of courage. For centuries, the Japanese had believed the emperor's voice to be divine, distant, untouchable. Now, they had heard it faint, human, breaking under the weight of defeat. And though his words marked the end of war, they also marked the beginning of something new. The possibility of life after ruin. As the sun set that evening, Tokyo glowed not with fire, but with twilight. The people stepped out into the streets for the first time without fear of air raids. Smoke still lingered over the horizon, but the bombs had stopped. Somewhere in the palace, the emperor sat in silence, his head bowed. He had given up everything a god could. his divinity, his pride, his empire, so that his people might live outside. A few could still hear the echo of his trembling voice drifting through the static, a voice that had ended one world and begun another. August 16, 1945, the morning after the broadcast, the sun rose over a nation in quiet disbelief. The war, the very air Japan had breathed for more than a decade, was gone. Yet no one quite knew what peace meant. Across Tokyo, streets once filled with smoke and panic now held a strange calm. People wandered as if in a dream. In the ruins of Shitamachi, mothers searched for food among the ashes of their homes. Men stood in line before burned-out government buildings, holding ration cards for supplies that no longer existed. For many, the surrender was not liberation, it was loss. The emperor's words had been clear enough in tone, if not in meaning. Japan had accepted the enemy's terms. The divine mission of the empire, the promise of eternal victory, had vanished overnight. Some citizens still refused to believe it. Rumors spread that the broadcast had been falsified by the Americans. Others claimed it was only a temporary pause in fighting. But reality could not be denied for long. Allied aircraft, once symbols of terror, now flew overhead dropping leaflets, not bombs. They carried instructions for surrender, orders for disarmament, and messages of peace. In the countryside, the news reached slower. Farmers stopped work, gathered by radios, and listened to rebroadcasts repeated throughout the day. Some knelt in the fields, tears falling into the soil. They whispered prayers for sons lost in China, Burma, and the Pacific sons who would never come home. But not all wept. For those who had lived through the inferno of Tokyo's fire, or the endless hunger of the blockade, the surrender was a mercy. An old woman, her home reduced to cinders, told a reporter, "We can finally sleep." For others, peace was a word too fragile to trust. In the imperial palace, the atmosphere was equally heavy. Many officers could not bear the shame of survival. Within hours of the broadcast, several senior military leaders, including War Minister Anami Korechika, took their own lives. Before dying, Anami wrote a final message: "I with my death humbly apologize to the emperor for the great crime." His ritual suicide symbolized the last act of loyalty of a dying ideology. Elsewhere, young officers, ashamed and confused, followed his example. In remote bases, some soldiers shot themselves before surrendering to the Allies. On islands scattered across the Pacific, garrisons continued fighting, unaware that the war had ended. For weeks, American patrols encountered Japanese soldiers who refused to believe the emperor had spoken. Some would hold out for months. Others, isolated in the jungles of the Philippines or the caves of Guam, would not surrender for years. Meanwhile, the machinery of occupation began to move. In Guam, General Douglas MacArthur prepared to enter Japan at the head of Allied forces. He ordered restraint and discipline, knowing that even a single act of vengeance could reignite violence. "We are not entering Japan as conquerors," he said, "but as liberators." Back in Tokyo, the government scrambled to maintain order. Police were instructed to prevent riots and suicides. Propaganda offices, once churning out posters of victory, now printed messages of calm. "The war has ended," one headline read, "but Japan endures." In the days following the surrender, a collective silence swept the nation. Trains resumed, factories tried to restart, and families searched for the missing. Yet, everywhere, an invisible question lingered. What are we now? The empire was gone. The divinity of the emperor was shaken. The soldiers were returning home to nothing but rubble and ghosts. But for the first time in years, the night sky over Japan was dark and still. No flames, no bombers, only the faint, unsteady sound of radios replaying the voice that had ended the war and begun the long, uncertain work of survival. The Allied occupation of Japan began with silence, not gunfire. On August 28, 1945, the first American aircraft touched down at Atsugi Airfield near Tokyo. Soldiers stepped cautiously onto Japanese soil, uncertain of what to expect. They had been trained for fanatical resistance, ambushes, even suicide attacks. Instead, they found rows of Japanese soldiers standing in perfect formation, rifles stacked, heads bowed. No resistance, no sound, only obedience. 2 days later, General Douglas MacArthur arrived, pipe in hand, stepping from his aircraft into the humid air of a defeated empire. Photographs captured the moment. The supreme commander of the Allied powers walking with casual confidence. The Japanese officers rigidly saluting. It was not just a military occupation, it was a symbolic inversion of everything Japan had once believed. Tokyo, still a skeleton of ash and steel, became the headquarters of a new era. The American flag rose over the city for the first time. From the ruins of war, an experiment in reconstruction began, one that would reshape Japan's identity forever. Disarmament and reckoning. Within weeks, the Japanese military ceased to exist. The imperial army, once numbering millions, was dismantled. Weapons were collected, uniforms burned, and military schools closed. War industries were stripped bare. Tanks became scrap metal. Aircraft were destroyed en masse. The occupation authorities imposed sweeping reforms, political, social, and moral. The Allied General Headquarters (GHQ) began purging ultranationalists, rewriting laws, and disbanding organizations that had fueled wartime aggression. The notorious Kenpatai, Japan's military police, was dissolved, but the greatest reckoning came in the form of justice. In May 1946, the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, the Tokyo War Crimes Trials, convened. 28 of Japan's wartime leaders stood accused of crimes against peace, humanity, and war atrocities. Among them were generals, ministers, and diplomats who had once ruled Asia with iron and fire. For 2 years, the trials revealed horrors from the Nanjing massacre to human experimentation in Manchuria. Some defendants were sentenced to death, others to life imprisonment, but one figure was spared. The emperor becomes human. General MacArthur made a controversial decision. Emperor Hirohito would not be tried. He would remain on the throne as a symbol, not a ruler. The logic was strategic. MacArthur believed that keeping the emperor as a stabilizing figure would prevent rebellion and ease the transition to democracy. And so, the divine was remade as mortal. In 1946, Hirohito renounced his divinity in a historic statement known as the Human Declaration. In formal, restrained language, he told his people, "The ties between us and our people have always stood upon mutual trust and affection. They do not depend upon mere legends or myths." The emperor, once seen as a living god, had become a man who walked among his people. He toured the countryside, visiting bombed cities and listening to survivors. Children bowed, then stared in wonder as he spoke to them directly. For the first time, they realized their ruler had a human voice, the same one they had heard through static the day Japan surrendered. This transformation marked the rebirth of Japan. Under Allied supervision, a new constitution was drafted and promulgated in 1947. It enshrined democracy, equality, and civil rights, and most notably, Article 9, which renounced war forever. Japan would never again maintain an army for aggression. Factories that once produced bombs began building sewing machines and radios. Women, once silenced, gained the right to vote. The economy slowly awakened. The black markets gave way to rebuilding. Schools reopened. Streets filled with bicycles instead of soldiers. But beneath this resurgence lay quiet grief, the weight of memory, of what had been lost. The old generation carried it in silence. The young grew up beneath it like a shadow. By the early 1950s, Japan was no longer an empire. It was a nation learning how to live. And though the fires of war had been extinguished, one echo remained, the trembling voice that had ended it. It was still replayed in schools, on anniversaries and documentaries. The faint recording that had once crossed the airwaves now lived in memory. The moment when a god spoke as a man, and a nation of warriors laid down its arms. The war that began with thunder ended with a whisper. August 15, 1945, remains not just a date in Japan's history but a moment when an entire civilization exhaled. The voice that echoed through the air that day carried more than surrender. It carried the death of an empire, the rebirth of a people, and the enduring question of what it means to survive. In the decades that followed, Japan transformed itself with quiet determination. From the rubble rose neon cities, bullet trains, and technology that would redefine the modern world. But beneath the brilliance of progress, that day's silence still lingers in memorials, in the bowed heads of aging survivors. In the yearly pause at 12 o'clock noon every August 15th, the voice from the sky, once a symbol of divine command, became something far more human. It was the sound of fragility, of humility, of truth spoken after too much silence. In those trembling words, Hirohito did not speak as a god, nor as a ruler. He spoke as a man burdened by the weight of countless deaths and the impossible mercy of surrender. For the world, it was the end of the most devastating war in human history. For Japan, it was the beginning of learning to live without myth. And yet, the broadcast endures thin, distant, crackling with age because it captures something eternal. That in humanity's darkest moments, survival itself can be an act of courage. When the emperor's voice reached his people through the static, Japan did not simply lay down its arms. It laid down its illusion of invincibility. And from that surrender, it found peace. 80 years later, the recording still plays not as an anthem of defeat, but as a testament to endurance, because sometimes history turns not on the roar of battle, but on the trembling voice of a man who dared to say, "We have resolved to endure the unendurable," and through that voice a nation learned to begin again.